Australia, good afternoon, East and West Coast, good evening to all our friends in Europe. Actually, if you're in Australia, it's way too early and you should probably go back to bed. But anyway, welcome. I am Lane Nooney. I'm a computer and video game historian in the Media Studies Department at New York University. I'm also one of the co-founders and managing editor of ROMchip, a journal of game histories, which is the entity kind of hosting today's talk. I shepherd that journal alongside my amazingly talented collaborators and co-editors, Henry Lowood, David Parisi, and Soraya Murray. Give a shout out if you're in the chat. And I'm so excited to have everyone joining us here today for the latest in this irregular series of Twitch talks that we host called ROMchip Presents. Earlier this summer, we hosted Chaim Gingold and Will Wright. And in the new year, we'll be talking with folks like Jesper Juhl and Rachel Plotnick. So if you don't already follow or subscribe to our newsletter or our Discord, join us, hop in there, stay on top of what we're doing. We'll post links in the chat so you can get connected in all the right ways. So now if I was teaching a class right now, this is where I would be like, raise your hand if you've heard of ROMchip. And I know there must be some people out there who are new to our mission. So here's the deal. What are we, right? If you've never heard of this before. We are an open access hybrid audience venue, online venue for the publication of game history, right? So what does that mean? As a publishing venue, we develop, solicit, edit, and publish work across a range of formats: traditional peer-reviewed articles, interviews, oral histories, short essays, object lessons, translations, dealing with everything from video games to board games, analog games, sports, and play. As an open access journal, we have no paywall, no advertising, no logins, no predatory publishing model. You don't ever have to pay a thing to read the research published inside of ROMchip ever. That is our unending commitment to game history. Our authors keep their copyrights. We're really trying to model a different kind of future for research publishing. And last, we call ourselves hybrid audience because we're trying to create a big tent around game history, a place where we can have rigorous historical engagement with as many people as possible who want to do that work. So part of our mission is that we believe you shouldn't need a PhD to be able to write for or interview for or even just read ROMchip. So this current talk series, ROMchip Presents, is an extension of that mission to bring historical work to a live audience through the power of Twitch. This talk series began this past winter as a run-up to our first ever Twitch fundraiser, which happened in May. And that fundraiser was so successful, it gave us capacity to keep hosting these incredible speakers while also running this truly one-of-a-kind research venue. And all of this underscores why your support matters. ROMchip is an absolute labor of love and commitment to sharing historical knowledge, and we are really only to make all of this happen because of the community's capacity to recognize this work as valuable, to see the fun going on here, and to support this work. Big institutions aren't going to save us. We're not backed by anybody. We are funded by our readers. Universities aren't going to save us. Corporations aren't going to save us. But actually, a small legion of donors is. Your pennies are paying for the guys on the back end who keep this running. Hey, Cody and Conway. They're paying for our copy editor. They're paying for our service fees. You make this possible for us. And so, if you're in a position to give, I encourage you, invite you, nay, I might even insist. You click the link below to donate.romchip.org. Every donation we get, even outside our fundraising season, helps us squeak a little bit more fun and stability for everything we're up to. And speaking of our fundraiser, so it's just been announced here that our 2025 fundraiser will take place Saturday, February 22nd, 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. So mark your calendar. That's Saturday, February 22nd of next year. We're going to have a return of some fan favorites like Jason Scott, new faces like game designers M. Kopis and Colleen Macklin. It's going to be a really cool time. Again, subscribe to our newsletter for more updates as they come. And one last little announcement before I introduce today's speaker. I wanted to just take a little bit of a moment here to honor and embarrass one of the folks in our chat. Very recently, ROMchip went looking for an editorial assistant. And as of this week, we are thrilled to say that we've added Logan Brown as this journal's assistant managing editor. So Logan is a newly appointed assistant professor in the communication department at the University of Iowa. He was the co-editor of the maintenance and repair issue of ROMchip back in July 2023. And his work, which is super interesting and fun and groundbreaking, is an early history of mobile games like pre-iPhone. But really, he was hired for his exceptional professionalism and his deep commitment to game history. We are the ones who are lucky to have him, so congratulations to you, Logan, and seriously, thank you. We would not be able to do any of this without you either. All right, so with all of that out of the way, it's my honor and pleasure to get to the project of introducing today's speaker. So, José P. Zagal is a professor in the University of Utah's Entertainment, Arts, and Engineering program. He's the author of Ludoliteracy, Defining, Understanding, and Supporting Games Education, a co-editor of the Video Game Ethics Reader, editor-in-chief of the Transactions of the Digital Games Research Association, aka DIGRA. Now that's his bio on the MIT Press site. I kept kind of like digging around Google for more fun facts, like the fact that in 2016, Jose was honored as a DIGRA Distinguished Scholar, that he's published a book called Game Design Snacks, which, to my dismay, was not a cookbook for game designers, but a pretty cool collection of essays of easily digestible game design wisdom. He's also co-edited a collection celebrating 50 years of Dungeons and Dragons that will also published this year. It's like the hits just don't stop with you, Jose, right? And all of this just speaks to Jose's incredible intellectual and creative curiosity. A few years ago, I was lucky enough to visit his program at the U of Utah, and I got to see firsthand what an incredible learning and making community is thriving there, right? So I've been a big fan of Jose ever since, and I can't wait to get your deep cuts on The Virtual Boy that you're pulling from the book you co-authored with Benj Edwards, Seeing Red, Nintendo's Virtual Boy, which you are here to share with us today. And with that, I'm going to get out of the way, hand this over to Jose, and let you do your thing. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for the intro. That's very, thank you. I'm doing good. I'm feeling very flattered, and thankful and grateful for being here. Happy to talk about what Benj and I put together for MIT Press, our platform study series with Seeing Red. And whoops. Okay, so let's take it away. Like I mentioned, well, I guess like Lane brought up, this isn't a project I worked on by myself. This is something that I had a collaborator for. That's Benj Edwards. Sadly, he couldn't be with me here today to talk about the book. So all the pressure is on me, but that's actually a nice way for me to say that any mistakes I make today, that's my fault. Anything I thought was insightful, cool, or super exciting, that's all Benj. Benj is a tech historian. He's the power behind the throne of vintagecomputing.com. He's also a senior AI correspondent with Ars Technica. So let's talk a bit about Seeing Red, Nintendo's Virtual Boy. What is this book? It's a platform study, and I think I thought it might be good for me to kind of explain kind of what that means to hopefully set the tone for what I'm planning to do over the next 45 minutes or so. So a platform study basically starts with this idea, well, there's a platform, I'm going to study that. And so what is a platform? It's sort of this combination of hardware and software and architecture. By architecture, I mean like hardware architecture, not sort of buildings and bricks architecture necessarily. Piece of hardware and the accompanying software and so on, this will have some technical limitations and some capabilities. And it is those technical limitations and capabilities that will shape the kinds of games that will appear on it, how those games are made, and ultimately what the player experience with those games will be. Now, the platform study isn't an idea that I came up with by any stretch of the imagination. I think we should lay the blame on Nick Montfort and Ian Bogost when they published their book, Racing the Beam. This is sort of the first book that kind of brought this idea to a broader audience. So they wrote a platform study about the Atari 2600. And they basically made this sort of argument to kind of explain, look, this is how this hardware works. And because of the limitations and the context of that hardware, we get these games that look a certain way, play a certain way, and so on. I'm super excited to be a part of this series as a whole. There's lots of other books out there for lots of other different kinds of platforms. And so what I'll be doing today is sort of going over those technical limitations and capabilities, talk about how that shapes the kinds of games that came out. But I thought it had a component which I think is perhaps special or unique a little in a way to the Virtual Boy, which is the social, the cultural, and the technological context in which the Virtual Boy comes out. So basically those three squares right there, those three blocks are kind of the plan for today. We'll talk about the context, what was a Virtual Boy, how does it work, and what does that mean if we sort of look at the games that came out for it. So let's travel back in time to 1995. We are Nintendo, and we have just launched this device, the Virtual Boy. Now, if you've heard anything about the Virtual Boy, you've probably heard about it in the context of it being one of the worst consoles ever made of all time. So if you just sort of type in like worst game console of all time, you're going to get a whole bunch of different articles, and I would almost guarantee that the Virtual Boy will be somewhere on that list. Maybe not in the first place, but definitely somewhere on that list. It's also on the Wikipedia page for commercial failures in video games, which I think is kind of unfair, but it doesn't matter. Virtual Boy was at the V, so it's like at the very bottom of the list. There's all kinds of other things up before it. Okay. So you might be wondering, well, what was this thing, the Virtual Boy? And I thought I might explain it, kind of give you guys the brief overview of what it is as a platform, as a gaming device, but just going to this ad essentially and saying, look, this is how the Virtual Boy was presented. It's a 32-bit gaming console, right? It is basically a headset. It has a controller, kind of a wishbone-shaped controller that plugs into the headset itself. It has stereo sound, and it featured true 3D graphics. And the meaning of that we'll get into a little bit later on. The device itself sits on a stand, and the idea is you sort of peer into it and look into it. Okay. The games on a Virtual Boy, notoriously for many, basically all look like this. They're all red and black, varying shades of red. I'm going to give you guys a couple of screenshots from different games. This is a Mario Tennis game. And when it came out, people were like, oh my God, this thing came out. It's all red. This is good or bad. Some people hated it. Other people liked it, and so on. And somebody wondering, well, it seems kind of like an oddball machine. How does, it doesn't make any sense, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that too. So the question here is, well, okay, so this thing comes out in 1995. It's kind of a weird thing. It has an interesting name, the Virtual, what does that mean? Boy, okay, maybe like the Game Boy comes out. And so what I want you to talk about now is, well, let's go back to 1985. In fact, let's go back a little bit earlier. Let's go back to the earlier 90s. Let's roll back a couple of years before that and ask ourselves, if we were in 1991, 1992, early 90s, what is the future of the video game industry from that perspective, from that moment in time? So if we're in the 1990s, what's new and exciting? Where are video games going? What are people imagining or seeing as a new and exciting thing? And I think one of the things that this sort of question we don't often think about, right? We're always very much focused on our present, what's coming in our future, and anything that happened in the past, we have this notion that, well, that was the way it had to be. And so I really want to make the argument that in the 1990s, it was a sort of a Wild West moment where there was a lot of stuff in the air and no one knew what was going to happen. Let me give you an example. So first of all, virtual reality was a thing, and it was a thing that was famous in the sort of the mass media sense, famous in the sort of wide audience. Howard Rheingold published a book called Virtual Reality. The subtitle there is The Mind-Boggling Bestseller. And what's interesting about that as well, is it mind-boggling the fact that this book about virtual reality was a bestseller, or is it a bestseller because virtual reality is kind of this mind-boggling concept? And I think it was a bit of both. Hollywood had released a couple of movies, The Lawnmower Man that came out, and that kind of really put VR on the map. And people were excited, like there's this new technology, and this seems like you're going to wear these helmets, and you're going to have these suits, and it'll be all like 3D graphics and so on. So that's one thing that was new and exciting. The second thing was, well, the internet. The internet was new and exciting. People being connected on this global network. People were starting to hop on to America Online, also more broadly. People were now playing games remotely, with each other, with friends, across the country. Doom was a big part of this, right? The first web browsers are just starting to come out, and people like discovering the entire universe of living online, being online, sharing information online. So maybe the future of video games is the internet. I don't know. Like it's 1990s. Maybe this whole thing is a dud. We'll find out. Multimedia was a thing too. You have to think we were moving from sort of cartridges for video games or floppy disk with limited capacity to all of a sudden, in context, infinite storage capacity. Here's a CD-ROM, I can hold 640 megabytes. What are we going to do with so much storage? I know, it's video and better graphics and so on. So games are starting to explore that, and people are seeing this as a future. This is the moment when Microsoft and Carta, it was like a big hit, and which in hindsight, it's like, that makes no sense. Why would people be excited? No, people were excited to show animations, show video, show high definition, for the time, pictures on the computers. So the future is going to be sort of this multimedia bonanza. This is also the time when 3D graphics are finally becoming a thing at the consumer level, right? This is when we start to see the first consumer level graphics acceleration cards. And this is when we start to talk about 3D graphics, and Nintendo has this new chip that is on a cartridge, and you can play Star Fox, and people are like, wow, this is so amazing. This is the future. Now, these are the new exciting things at this time, early 90s, but also there's a general sense of the general trend of, things are just always going to get better what we already have. So we're going to have better graphics, we're going to have faster processors, everything is moving by leaps and bounds. More memory, better sound, they're going to have sound cards and special, this is when it's sort of Dolby 5.1 and more speakers than just the two. It's all becoming a thing. Okay. So as a context, no one really knows what the future of video games is going to be or where things are going to go, but everybody's throwing everything into the fire. And I want to give you sort of just straight up data points that seem crazy now. So here's a timeline, 1991 all the way to 1995. I put the Virtual Boy there down in the corner because that's when it was released. And let's look at major console releases in this time period. So in 1991, we get the Philips CDI is released. 1992, the NEC Turbo Duo, which is an upgrade to the TurboGrafx. 1993, we get the 3DO Interactive, the Atari Jaguar, Amiga CD32. In 94, we get the Genesis, the Saturn, the PlayStation, and the Neo Geo CD. In 95, in a different color scheme, Apple releases the Bandai Pippin. Now, from our perspective today, we look at those like, oh yeah, that one's going to die, that one's not going to work, that one's going to be a flop, that one's too expensive, et cetera, et cetera. But in the moment of the 1990s, there's so much choice, so many options. Who's going to win? We don't know. Who's going to, be successful? We don't know, and so on. And so it is in this context that the Virtual Boy comes out. It's a context of, in a certain way, it's sort of like anything goes. Let's just throw stuff at the wall. We're going to make a play. Some people are playing on the CD multimedia angle, other people on more connectivity, and et cetera, 3D graphics. All this is getting rolled into everything that would become what video games will be, right? We can look back now in hindsight, and we can see that trajectory. We know which ones were hits and explain why. But in the early 1990s, we don't know. Is the PlayStation going to be a bomb? Maybe, right? We don't know. We need to wait and see. So it's a giant question mark. No one really knows what's going to happen. There's a lot of money on the line, a lot of interest and excitement to be the next big thing, and who knows? So what does Nintendo do in this context? What are Nintendo's plans? What have they been working on? And here I need to point to Gunpei Yokoi. He was sort of a superstar and Nintendo inventor, engineer, game designer. He's sort of the person behind the Game & Watch, also the person behind the Game Boy, both of which have been huge hits for Nintendo. And it is his responsibility, or not his responsibility, I say it was his influence that is still there with Nintendo in terms of how does Nintendo go about doing things. And in his words, what Nintendo does is, okay, we're not really worried about the state of the art in terms of technology. What we like to do is we look to old technology that's mature, that we understand, that we can make very cheaply, that is reliable, that is robust, and so on. And we look to see how we can use that technology to make new kinds of video games. This is sort of Yokoi's design philosophy, which he called, and this sort of a loose translation from the Japanese, lateral thinking with withered technology. Sort of, how can we take something that's already out there and come up with a new way to use it? And so that's sort of the heart of the thinking behind the Virtual Boy and other Nintendo products as well. And we'll get into what that meant specifically for the Virtual Boy. And he's thinking, well, what is this future going to be? What should entertainment be? Yokoi wasn't particularly excited by this idea of, yeah, well, we'll just have better graphics, more colors, faster processors. He wanted to think of new kinds of experiences. And that's sort of what drew him to this idea, this concept of playing games in a different way that would inform and then result in what the Virtual Boy was. Okay, so let me give you now a slightly different context, right? And here, let's imagine, well, not imagine, this is what happened. Virtual Boy is about to launch, and Nintendo needs to figure out how are we going to sell this thing. Now, at that moment in time, Nintendo was sort of in this neck-to-neck battle with Sega. Nintendo's challenge was our machines, our consoles, our games have a sort of a reputation of being kind of childish and for little kids. And the little kids that grew up playing Nintendo are now teenagers, and we need to like address them. Sega has been kind of eating our lunch here a little bit. They're the edgy, the cool, the hip console to have, and we're kind of like the air quotes lame, family friendly one. And so Nintendo decides to roll out a campaign. They call it the Play Out Loud campaign, which is going to be edgier, sort of more teenager-y, more more out there. There's an example of some of the ads. So different kind of crazy fonts, very 90s from our perspective nowadays. And they're sort of experimenting with things and trying to remind people, hey, Nintendo can be cool too. Believe us, we're out here as well. There's a paper ad for Super Mario World 2, which is sort of a cute, you're playing a baby Mario, but no, the ad is, this baby room is soiled diapers stuck to the walls. It's a very different take on Nintendo. And so they're kind of experimenting with looking cool and being cool. And so it is in this context of this sort of campaign, of this media push, that the Virtual Boy is going to be released. And they came up with a tagline, and the tagline was a 3D game for a 3D world. They ran a bunch of ads and ad campaigns and so on. And this picture here just gives us this idea of what the general theme was. And this is a post-apocalyptic wasteland situation where there's this Virtual Boy device, very sort of Mad Max vibes. I won't read the text there on the ad. You can look this up online afterwards. And the idea is that there's this device that is sort of like a monster that's sort of creeping around this wildlands, and it captures you and kind of captures the player and sort of sucks you in and slams you into the controller, and now you're in the 3D world. They're also playing with this idea of sort of the mind-melting qualities of being in, a 3D game that is actually there. And they actually stuck to this notion of this is what the Virtual Boy is, even when they were sort of discontinuing it and trying to get rid of it. So here, like when it was already on sale for $99, which is not what it cost at launch, they're focusing on this idea of the third dimension, right? This is what this device is bringing to the market. This is what's new about it. And you might wonder why is this so special? Well, their challenge was, at the time, 3D meant things like this, like Virtua Fighter 2 with these sort of polygonal graphics, or Star Fox itself. And what they're trying to say is like, no, these are 3D graphics. Our games have a 3D world. It's a real 3D environment that you'll get to participate, sort of get immersed into and get sucked into in a certain way. And they sort of realize, this is really hard to sell and to communicate or explain with screenshots or with sort of print ads and so on. And so Nintendo partners with Blockbuster, and they run a special deal campaign where you could go to a Blockbuster and you could rent. So at Blockbuster, you could rent video games, which is something Nintendo never really liked. In fact, there was a lawsuit and so on and so forth. But at this point, Nintendo said, well, screw it. We're just going to work with them anyways, because we need their stores, we need their locations to get people to try the Virtual Boy out so they see how different, how special this is. So you could go to Blockbuster, you could rent a Virtual Boy, a couple games for the weekend. You'd actually get a special carrying case. The Virtual Boy is in this. These are now sort of collector's items, obviously. Go to Blockbuster, rent this out, try the games, and then get a coupon for a discount on the actual hardware yourself. What did this result in? Well, the Virtual Boy, there was this, I'll describe it as lukewarm. Some people loved it, some people didn't like it, and most people were kind of, okay. The Virtual Boy didn't fly off the shelves despite these attempts to like really convince people into getting it. But the key point is what they were trying to do. They're trying to say, look, you need to try this thing. We don't want you to be confused with 3D polygonal graphics. This is a different kind of experience. See for yourself. It wasn't a bait and switch kind of thing. It was like, no, literally, like try it out and play these games and see if you like them. How many games did the Virtual Boy have? It was a total of 22 different games. On the left here, we have the games that were released in the US. On the right, the ones in Japan. There's an overlap between them, obviously. Some were released in both places. The ones at the bottom, so the 3D Tetris, Nestor's Funky Bowling, and Waterworld, were US-only releases, and there were 8 Japan-only releases up top. And I'm basically bringing up this list. These are all the games that came out officially for the Virtual Boy. It's a very limited softography, if you want. How many of these games are actually by Nintendo? So first-party games, these 5. Okay. Obviously, with their counterparts in the US. So why? A lot of people wonder, well, why did it fail? Why did it do not? Why wasn't it a success? What happened? And one of the things we argue in the book is that, well, there's this context of what should video games be that people weren't super clear about. And I think there was also a certain amount of market confusion. Okay. The question here being is, well, what was this Virtual Boy thing supposed to be in the first place? Okay. Is it a console? Is it like a computer? Is it a VR device? Is it a handheld? What is it called? What is it like the next version of the Game Boy? And people are kind of confused by that. And the pricing, I think, in this case is interesting if you consider it. So the Virtual Boy came out at launch price was $179. And I'll just give you the sense of, if you look at other categories, market categories at the time, if you compare the Virtual Boy to a home console, it was kind of cheap, actually. So the Nintendo 64 came out at $199, PlayStation at $300, Saturn cost $400, famously expensive at the time. And so $179 for a console doesn't seem too expensive. Now, if you compare it to a handheld device, maybe it kind of fits. The Game Boy was pretty cheap at $89, but the Genesis Nomad, which came out the same year as the Virtual Boy, is $180. So in that sense, it's kind of priced in that context. If you compare the Virtual Boy price-wise to VR systems, it is incredibly cheap. Right? The Victor Master, which was the cheap one at that moment, came out at $200 when it was released a couple of years before that, all the way up to $1,000. These are consumer-grade devices. So the pricing wasn't necessarily a good sign of what this device was or what it's supposed to be. The result being that the Virtual Boy was ultimately discontinued in December of '95 in Japan, and then August next year in the United States. How much did it sell? Roughly 800,000 units are sold. They're sort of the best estimates that I've seen so far. So this is the story of the Virtual Boy coming out, not really making a huge impact when it's released, and then quickly being canceled by Nintendo. Why did they cancel it so quickly? Lots of speculation. There's very little sort of direct knowledge that we do have. We do know is that at that time, Nintendo was really worried about being late to market with what would eventually become named the Nintendo 64. They were famously already behind. PlayStation was already out when the Virtual Boy came out. And so there's this idea like, oh no, Nintendo's scrambling. We need to get something on the market so that people remember us and know that we're still a viable game company and so on, as a sort of a in-between snack before we hit everybody with a Nintendo 64. My sense is also that the resources being dedicated to the Virtual Boy were then sort of allocated to the Nintendo 64 to help it come out. It was already late, but less late than it would have otherwise. Okay. So let's talk a little about how it works now. So look at the Virtual Boy. That's what it looks like, from the non-player side. The player side, you're basically leading into this device. There's two rectangles in the middle. Those are basically, I'll call them the displays. They're not quite. We'll get into that. Let me show you how this works. So let's imagine we're going to grab this console, take it off the stand. We're going to flip it upside down and pop the cover. And it looks something like that. And then you'll notice there's the two white squares on the picture. There's the two ribbon cables, one labeled left, the other one labeled right. Let's pop those out, okay? And we basically get that. And in the middle there, so the green and yellow part of the picture, if we zoom in, that center bit, that's essentially the display. It's about 10 millimeters tall. The picture there on the corners is it all lit up. That's the display. There isn't a screen like you would have in VR devices or a screen like you have like a typical handheld. So it doesn't have a screen, but it does have a display. The display is basically made up of a bunch of red LEDs. This is called a scanned linear array. It's basically a tall column of red LEDs. This is like a very simplified picture. And how it works is each of those circles is an LED, and it'll light up when the right signal is received. And over time, different circles will light up and eventually creating a screen. Now, this whole array is 224 pixels tall, and the air quotes screen I've shown here is 384 pixels wide. And the way this works is basically, so it's a tall column that lights up in different moments, and then there's a mirror, two actually, one for each eye, that oscillate. And as the mirror oscillates, it's sort of like the column is moving across. So basically, it's panning, if you will, from left to right, but column by column, not row by row, like was the case for old CRT televisions and monitors. Because of the persistence of vision, so these lights will persist in our view. Basically, as these oscillate, they basically pan and create what we identify as a screen. I'm saying oscillate. Some people say they vibrate. They don't quite rotate. But they're sort of moving at the right speed so that as these LEDs are lighting up, they're basically painting the picture across your eyeballs in a column-wise, sort of from left to right. So it's not a VR device, right? But if it's not a VR device, what is it? That's my pet peeve, is when I see these stores like the Virtual Boy, Nintendo's VR headset. It's not a headset. It's not VR in any sense. It is stereoscopic, and we're getting into how that works. You sort of have to peer into it, but there's no sensors. It doesn't move around. It doesn't track your movement in any meaningful way, at all, and not even any meaningful way. So what is it? And here I think is one of the things that I think it's important. We don't do often enough, maybe when we're thinking about games, is connecting the tradition or what this device is doing to earlier traditions of entertainment. So I want to point you to perspective boxes, which are a technology from the 17th century. A perspective box is basically a box with a hole cut out, and you peer into one end, and the inside has been crafted in such a way as to give you something really interesting to look at, right? Whatever that is depending on who the designer is. The one in the picture there has sort of the side panel has sort of been taken off so you can see what's inside. This one, when you look in, you see a room, with a lot of depth and so on. And you're looking into a space that is bigger than is what is inside the box, and that's because of the way the walls inside the box have been painted and so on. If we fast forward, a couple of years, we get to similar devices. This is the Mondo Nuovo. Again, it's a device there's devices made to look into, and on the inside, you see these sort of amazing scenes, right? That carefully designed in different ways. This is sort of a form of popular mass entertainment at the time, and people that own these would travel around different towns and then set up shop, and people would come in and pay to look through them and enjoy themselves. Let's fast forward another couple hundred years, and these are similar to, it was a different kind of entertainment device that paper peep shows. Here we're looking at one from the front. What this device is more like is like this sort of, think of it as a paper accordion. And you notice that there's different layers. And so when you look at it from the front, some of these layers will be closer to the eye, and other layers will be further behind. So they'll be sort of out of focus, and you get the sense of depth. And you get to look into a scene that is a lot bigger than this rectangle shape that you're holding in your hands. So looking down the front, it might look something like this, right? So notice that this layer of the front here, which is kind of blurred out, and there's a lot of depth and detail all the way out to the back. So why am I bringing this all up is basically to say, yeah, the Virtual Boy was not a VR set. It's a peep box, but it's a digital peep box, and that's kind of interesting. That's a new thing that we hadn't really thought about. And its tradition doesn't come from pinball machines or games or video games. The tradition it's building on and sort of riffing off of is this tradition of sort of these dioramas, these peep boxes, these Mondo Nuovos, these devices. Okay, so how does it work? What does this mean for it to be digital, and how does it actually operate? So I'm going to talk briefly about the graphics architecture. Here I'm going to get a little bit into the technical weeds to basically highlight two things. One is that the Virtual Boy is really bad at pushing polygons, and by that I mean the traditional 3D graphics that we were talking about at the time, polygons with with sort of textures on them. That's something the Virtual Boy was bad at doing. It was not set up hardware-wise to do that. Rather, it is really good at pushing tiles and sprites, like most game consoles of the time, with ones predating. So we're talking Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, and all the ones prior to that. So really good at doing pictures like the one on the left there, that Mario. Really bad at polygonal Mario. Flat images, yes. Actual 3D graphics, no. And so what that means is that when you get to a lot of the games in the Virtual Boy's catalog, for example, Wireland, they're basically building off of this idea of these different layers that will have different depths from the viewer, and will create a sense of a scene that has a very particular and unique aesthetic quality. In the case of Virtual Boy Wireland, what you basically have is a typical sort of 2D side-scrolling platforming game where you're running around and jumping and making progress, but you can also jump, in this case, between a foreground and a background layer. But the game world itself is also made up of these multiple layers that give a greater sense of depth. And if they're moving at different rates, you'll get also a parallax effect too. Here's a sort of an animated GIF kind of showing the jumping backwards and forwards. Now, here I'll have to ask you to imagine that there is actual depth when you're looking through the Virtual Boy. Right? You can actually feel like, oh, we did really go far away. And a lot of Virtual Boy's games make use of the technology that powers this, and they have these different layers that are offset from each other. So here's Panic Bomber, for example, which is basically these I don't want to call it a Tetris, but I think you get the sense from the screenshots on the top left there. These objects are falling, you're playing against an AI opponent, but visually what you have is a background at the back, the very far back with the moon, and different layers in between. and different elements at different heights, right, at different depths. Now, this is seen from the front, but some of the games actually had a top-down view. So this is vertical force. In this case, the layers are top-down, as if you were sort of lying on your bed through the hole in the floor and kind of seeing depth in that way, so from the top-down view, which you can't really appreciate from the screenshot. And the picture on the side kind of shows how the ship has to alternate between it being at the top layer and going down to the bottom, and there's enemies at the bottom, and then there's enemies at the top. You kind of need to move backwards and forward. So what Benj Edwards and I call this is, as its aesthetic style, we're calling this a layer diorama. A lot of the games have the sense of, it's like looking into a diorama with different flat layers, and the 3D effect is created that way, right? Which is not the same as what you would have in a VR system or VR systems, modern VR systems, because here the depth is mostly created from flat images, right? And that sense is kind of unusual. So how does the Virtual Boy create depth from these flat images? The key word here is horizontal displacement, which is how basically the eyes do it and the brain does it together. The basic idea is each eye sees a different image, and some elements in each image are shifted horizontally, and depending on in which direction they're shifted and how they're shifted, that object will either be perceived as being closer to the eye or further away from the eye. Now this picture looks really complicated. I'm just going to explain one aspect of it. So let's imagine so at the top there I have what each eye is seeing, the left eye on the left and the right eye on the right. The black circle is going to be kind of our neutral. So that's there's a technical term, it's the horopter. It's basically the rate. It's from from the black circle is from that point where that stuff is either behind it or in front of it. Okay. So in this case, notice there's a blue triangle on the left. The left eye is seeing the blue triangle displaced horizontally inwards. And by inwards, I mean towards the nose, right? Towards your nose. Now the right eye is also seeing it displaced horizontally towards the nose. Okay. So in this case, it's going in the opposite direction because, on one case it's going to the right, the other case it's going to the left. That displacement, right, which is different on each eye, but both in the same relative direction as in towards the nose, results in the triangle being seen closer to the eye. So it's in front of the black circle. The oval, which is on the right there, is displaced in the opposite direction. So for the left eye, it is shifted outwards, so away from the nose. On the right eye, also shifted outwards, away from the nose. And this results when the brain kind of puts it all together again in that oval being further away. Okay, so this is a flat image that based on how it's shifted on a horizontal axis will then be seen as closer to the eye or further away from the eye. And the virtual basically is making use of this basic concept. So images are being shifted around to create the illusion of them being closer or further away from the eye. So what does a Virtual Boy do? Well, Nintendo actually has a bunch of tricks that its developers and designers and other people that made game frames employed. So technically, the game actually allows you to set 32 different layers. They call them worlds in the sort of the development manuals. And so here's an example of I guess this is 5 different worlds, 5 different layers being used at the same time. So if I put things on different layers, they will be in front or behind of each other. That's trick number 1 to get things to have some sense of depth. Second trick. This is a left eye image and the right eye image for the same element. And I'm going to quickly ask you, can you spot the difference? The white lines on that grid are just sort of to help orient the eye. Basically, this is a 4x4 tile image for each eye. Those of you who are super savvy and have, I guess, resolution on your monitors, and I'm hoping it's coming out okay on the stream, might notice there are some elements on that picture which are sort of shifted. They're not exactly, both images are not the same, and they're not symmetrical either. If you notice the eyebrow, the left eyebrow, kind of the frowny eyebrow there, the one on the left eye is kind of moved inwards, right? And with respect to what you're seeing on the right eye. Some of the frown, like the upside down smile there, is also kind of moved inwards on both of them. What this means, what this results in is, this is a block, is that section in the center, the 4x4 in the middle, that was actually then viewed when you're looking at it through the Virtual Boy as being closer to the eye than the rest of the image. So this flat image itself, when they designed the sprite, they baked in a horizontal displacement, and they need to make sure that the sprite is shown to the left eye and this other sprite shown to the right eye. So when you see that block, you automatically get sort of a 3D effect in the block itself. Okay, and what you can do then is the block itself can then be placed on different layers, and so now you can have the block a block appear closer to the eye, have another block that appears further away from the eye, and the top of that block will also appear further away and closer. So you you get some free layers, as it were, some extra additional depth when you do that within the same sprite itself. So I call it the second trick is what they do. Third trick, here's Teleroboxer. It's a kind of first-person boxing game. You're a robot, or you're controlling a robot, and you're boxing other robots, essentially. What they do here is they basically take a giant picture. In this case, let's say it's the giant robot, and the robot is actually broken down into multiple sprites. And what you can do is each of those different sprites in those different elements can be placed at different depths as well. And so you get a sort of a paper marionette, but with different layers of depth. For this one, for example, the head, you can show the head at one layer, but then you can have the fists independent from each other be on a different layer, so they could be closer to the eyes. And now it feels like this boxer is actually, his fists are like in front of him, and so on. This is not a new trick in the sense of taking a giant monster or an enemy and breaking it down to different sprites, but in this case, that trick is also being used to create a greater depth of the figure itself. Trick number 4 is, this is the cheat, is basically using all these tricks together at the same time in a single element. Pizza Rolls-Royce on Medium.com did a really cool analysis of an example of a particular enemy in Virtual Boy Land. So there's this, I'll call it a frog, and then you see like the sprite for the frog and sort of its animation. And normally in games of this kind, what you expect to see when you're going into the data on the ROM is some sort of a sprite sheet, which is kind of figured out on a grid and laid out. And so the animation, you would expect to see different sprites or different frames of an animation. And what you actually end up seeing in the Virtual Boy case is a sprite sheet that looks something like this, which is a complete mess compared to what you're expecting to find. And the reason it is done this way is because these different elements of the sprite are basically being used separately and animated separately and then composed to give you a sense of depth in the creature itself. So some elements of this creature will look to be closer to the eye and some will look to be further. If you actually take the sprite and compare the left eye version to the right eye version, here they're oscillating between each one. You notice that they're not the same. And what this means in this case is that the horn on the left is actually going to be perceived by the player to be further back, and the horn on the right and the hand actually going to be perceived to be in the front. And so you basically take in this creature, kind of chopped it up into little pieces, and then made sure that some of those pieces will be in front of the eye, and others, well, not in front of the eye, closer to the eye, and some will be further from the eye. For this creature, it's pretty simple, but they do the same trick with, for example, the protagonist. In this case, Wario is made up of 32 overlapping 8x8 sprites, and they're sort of laid out in a very careful way so that his eyes are this far away and the fist is this far away. So there's multiple layers within that sprite itself. Fifth trick, how does the Virtual Boy actually make some 3D? It's to do some actual 3D. This is an image in Mario's tennis game. And it doesn't look like this when you play the game. It looks like that. And it looks like this because it's been sort of rotated and shifted along certain axes, sort of in a fine mode that many of you are familiar. So when you play the actual game, it looks something like that. So there are sometimes when there is some actual 3D happening, and I'm using it in air quotes because it's sort of very limited in that sense. And to be fair, there are some games like Red Alarm and also the golf game that do have actual 3D, no textures, but just some of the sort of dithering on the golf game, and no textures at all in the case of Red Alarm. Red Alarm is interesting because there's actually a setting in the menu. You can configure the depth, and if you set it all the way to 0, the game becomes completely unplayable. It's just this mess of lines that you can't make sense of the world. And you have to actually kind of slide up the 3D effect for you to figure out, like, where's my ship with regards to the rest of the environment. And it's a pretty visually intense game to look at, but you do need that 3D in order to make it work. Okay. So I'm wondering, okay, well, that's how the Virtual Boy works. It has this unique aesthetic, the layer diorama. It was a product of its time and its context and situation and Nintendo's sort of philosophy to come out. What has happened since? And I think one of the interesting and exciting things about the Virtual Boy is that because it was on the market for so short a time and it was literally canceled, which is very unusual. Most consoles that fail are actually end up being on the market for a long time. They just shift to other marketplaces around the world. Nokia's N-Gage, for example, it's this handheld that came out and failed commercially, was actually available for many, many, many years. It just wasn't available in the US or in Europe and so on. It like moved to other territories. And what this has meant in the case of Virtual Boy is that there's a lot of interest and excitement in kind of finishing this console. This has included stuff like hardware mods made by fans. The Virtual Boy does have a port, and it allowed for, there was announced a link cable, so you can actually play 1v1 against another Virtual Boy with this cable. The cable is never released, so fans are sort of taking it upon themselves to make the cable, develop it, and put it out there, and you can buy it. There's also a lot of work in finding old games that were almost finished or were canceled right when the Virtual Boy was canceled. Bound High is a nice example where the source code is found, and then it's not complete, but you know what? We'll finish it. This is the fan community doing all this work. We'll compile it, and now we have the game, right? And then someone else finds like a later version of the source code and compiles it differently, and so you have different versions. So this is sort of slightly different from your typical homebrew, but it's about like completing the console in the sense of Nintendo had this plan, or this game was going to come out, and what would have the Virtual Boy have been like? What would it have been perceived like if it had actually if it had been given a fair shot, as it were? Obviously, there's a lot of homebrew games and homebrew hardware as well, sort of custom carts. You can like burn your own games to it and play them on the hardware. There's a whole development apparatus and scene and so on. I'm a big fan of the Hyper Fighting game, which is basically it's sort of like a Super Nintendo port of Street Fighter to the Virtual Boy. And what I like about it, you can actually get it on an actual physical cart, is that it sort of answers a what if question. It's a contemporaneous game that presumably Capcom could have made could have made Street Fighter for the Virtual Boy. So it sort of uses the same sprites and the same technology and so on. And there's also win-party games. This is sort of Battlezone, which was called Warzone, but it's sort of a Battlezone version, a Battlezone sort of game made by fans, released on hardware. I have my own right there, which is sort of neat. I think it's a lot of fan activity is about like, let's do some new things. But a lot of the Virtual Boy fan activity is, let's do some new things, but it's also, let's do some old things, and let's find the old things that didn't quite get out there. All this means is that the Virtual Boy fan community is really active and is doing really interesting work. Comparable, I think. I mean, the community is a lot smaller than, let's say, the Super Nintendo fan community, the Atari 2600 fan community, so on. But is doing a lot more sort of restoration, archival, conservation, and also sort of speculative work, which I think is kind of cool. And I do want to I have a huge shout out and thank you to Planet Virtual Boy, the website, but also the Discord, which is where most of the Virtual Boy fan community like to sort of hang out and do the work. It is thanks to their efforts and their work in sort of preserving, conserving, that Benj and I were able to put together this book. This is the moment where I sort of wrap up and say thank you very much. There's a lot more information and detail in the book. For example, if you're curious or you have this thought like, I think the Virtual Boy is just a gimmick, that's something we explore in depth in one of the chapters. But rather than just close the door, I also want to make sure to thank all the people, and this isn't a list, this isn't an inclusive list of everybody, the people and the groups and the teams and the communities that have been sort of fundamental. I think Planet Virtual Boy, mentioned them already, but also the Internet Archive, RetroMags, the Video Game History Foundation, and a lot of the fans. I mean, I think it's important to recognize that the work we do is always building on the shoulders of giants, and it doesn't matter if those giants are academics or scholars or people from the industry or fans. They're all giants regardless, and I think it's important to recognize that. So thanks to all the fans and all the hard work that everyone else has put in, in their own free time and so on. And also, we have to make sure to thank the University of Utah for supporting me in my work, and a lot of this work started when I was faculty at DePaul University as well, so shout out to them as well. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening. I appreciate your time, and I'm excited to hear your questions.
All right. Are we on screen? Okay, hey, we are. Hey there. I should have been looking at a different screen. All right. Jose, thank you so much for that talk. There was a lot of chatter in the chat from folks who were like, wow, I actually never had any idea of how the Virtual Boy works, or I sort of, knew it in many of the ways that I think you open with, this assumption of gimmickry, failure, right? A sort of kind of in the dark attempt to kind of capture an undefined market. So much appreciation for putting it into its historical context, right? I hadn't really thought of it as part of this ecosystem of 1990s consoles, all of which we've forgotten, right? And that it's kind of operating in that space. There are some questions filtering to the chat. First, I was just wondering if you could give us a little bit of insight into the origins of this project. You are a game design educator. What attracted you to writing about the Virtual Boy of all things? And how did you get into the collaboration with your co-author, Benj?
Yeah, so I started dabbling in the Virtual Boy many years ago, maybe 15 years ago at this point, maybe a little bit more, just out of curiosity and sort of whim. I sort of heard about this device. I didn't own one. I wasn't aware of it when it came out. I grew up and was born and raised in Chile. I don't think the Virtual Boy ever made its way to Chile in any official or perhaps even unofficial capacity. And so at that point, I started to buy consoles on eBay and get some games and see what was going on. This was when I was at DePaul University. Ran into a undergrad student at the time, Matt Zekera. And we started talking about collaborating and doing some things. And together, we started to look into the Virtual Boy a bit more seriously. We published an academic paper on that. But I still had that itch of, well, I think there's a bit more to say about the Virtual Boy. And then Nick Montfort's and Ian Bogo's Racing the Beam book came out about the Atari 2600. And that's when the light bulb went off in my head for saying, you know what, I think this would be a really cool book to write about. And writing a book is a chance, gives you sort of an alibi to doing the research and exploring it and diving deep into that. From that point onwards, many years passed. I sent them a book proposal. It wasn't very good. And I got, stuck doing other things and so on. And I got to the point where I realized that I was sort of procrastinating too much, moving forwards very, very slowly. Ian was very good. Both Ian and Nick were very good about every now and then sort of poking me and saying, hey, where's that thing, that you said you were going to do? Is it coming along? And then I realized, you know what, I just need someone to work with on this. And that's when I reached out to Benj. Benj had written an article about the Virtual Boy where he did sort of a deep dive into the patent side and the technology side, the licensing of the technology the Virtual Boy uses. A lot of people don't know, but the technology that the Virtual Boy uses was originally developed and licensed by an American company, and they were trying to, get it out there and sell it and so on. And so he had talked to the people that had developed the original technology that Nintendo then licensed. Benj and I got talking, and we realized that there was a good chance for us to collaborate in a way that I think is kind of unusual in academia, which is kind of where I sit, or where I mostly sit, because Benj is not an academic and I am, and I wanted to write a book that would be more accessible, and Benj wanted to write a book that sort of went into more depth than you might see in a typical sort of popular, book for sort of the fans. And so I'm hoping that we were able to hit like a sweet spot where the academics are like, okay, there's enough theory and meat on some of these bones, and the general audience and people interested in video games in general are, okay, this isn't super dry and makes no sensey sort of academies speak. And so that's how that collaboration came about. And I'm super grateful to Benj for kind of bearing with me when my academic ease was too academic and helped us, dial it back and bring it to hopefully it's a sweet spot for that.
I love the idea that it's a good piece of writing advice that if you're stuck on a project, get a co-author. I never thought about it that way. I want to dive into some questions from the chat because there's some beefy ones in here. Capcom MDB has a question, and please correct my pronunciation of the designer's name, Gunpei Yokoi. Capcom says they're an old-fashioned designer. For instance, he referenced Popeye cartoons and traditional animation techniques later in the context of like the Game & Watch, right? Or latter in the context of the Game & Watch. So I get the impression he would have been exposed to Pete boxes or similar toys. Capcom says, I haven't read your book yet, but what documentary or oral evidence did you find regarding the specific types of references the designers and artists were drawing on? So I think this is kind of a question about like, what do we know biographically about these figures that kind of contributed to the production of these artifacts? Oh, hold on. Sorry, everybody. We're having a little graphics blip. Hang on with us for one quick minute while we figure this out. Anyway, yeah, he disappeared. Sorry, everybody. Is his audio still good? Okay, okay. We've lost him entirely. So this is where I juggle. I should have brought, I can show you some artifacts on my desk while we wait here. My Windows solitaire balanced piece of stained glass, right? That might be of interest. I'm not going to play King's Quest. Please don't ever make me. Okay, all right, I can shut up. Go ahead and hit that question, Jose. Yeah, this question has broken this Twitch account. All right, are we good?
Okay. Hello? Can you hear me?
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for that question, Capcom MDD. It's a really interesting one. So first of all, one of the things that drew Gunpei Yokoi to the technology when it was sort of pitched to him was these graphics, these images, these red pixels sort of floating in a completely black background. And I think it's one of the interesting things where it's worth trying the Virtual Boy in its original hardware incarnation, because there's this neoprene visor that goes around, that sort of fits around the eyes, and kind of does actually sort of black out the rest of the world. And so you're seeing a screen that's sort of floating in nothingness. And Yokoi has, and this is in interviews he gave with a friend of his, and there's a couple of books in Japanese that haven't really made their way to the West, other than a translation by Florent Gorge that was published in France, where he sort of talks about this idea of making entertainment that exists in this nothingness and the different kinds of experiences you could come up with. In the broader sense of sort of Japanese culture, there is a tradition, I'm forgetting the name right now, of these sort of layered dioramas. I don't remember entirely if it was sort of a puppet kind of situation or...
Someone mentioned them in chat, actually.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I'm scrolling up to find the name.
And I want to be careful what we're not saying, and this story might be different to the extent that internal documentation from Nintendo is ever made public. We're not saying that, Yokoi had a peat box and he thought, oh, let's make video games with this. What we're saying is, if we start from further back, you say, okay, human beings have always been kind of drawn to optical illusions and tricking your eyes into seeing things that aren't there. And we see this concept sort of play out in different devices over the time. And the peat box is just one of them, right? These optical illusions where you're looking into this box and you're seeing a room that's much bigger than the space. And that's, for mirrors and perspectives and so on and so forth. And so in that sense, the Virtual Boy is a part of that tradition of wonder and amazement, the 3D stereo and looking into space is sort of bigger than the box allows for. So sort of tapping into what we're thinking of as a very sort of natural human interests that is a part of our curiosity going, thousands of years back, right? These notions of like tricking the eyes into seeing things, and I think of the kaleidoscopes as well as these sort of toys, and the stereograph as well, right? This is a couple hundred years ago at this point.
No, totally. The term for the Japanese paper theater is kamishibai.
Kamishibai, thank you.
Kamishibai. Another question from Block Tropics was they say, if the Virtual Boy proved to be a success, would it have replaced one of Nintendo's existing product hardware categories like console or handheld, or would it have been a third pillar? If it was imagined as the latter, do we have any insight to how they plan to support 3 different types of hardware concurrently in the mid-90s? It's sort of like a question about, do we have a sense that Nintendo had a plan for what was going to happen if this had taken off?
Yeah, that's really an excellent question. The information that we do have is that within Nintendo as a whole, there was an interest in stereoscopy writ large / virtual reality. So the VR was a thing that they were aware of. It seems very likely that there were 2 different projects going on within Nintendo at the same time. And at the time was also Nintendo's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, was also famous for sort of having internal groups compete against each other and to see who would come across. So there is knowledge of a separate group that was working on I'll call it a air quotes more traditional VR-like system that was ultimately sort of canceled. And this is a partnership they had with Argonaut. And so there was an interest in doing that. But the question of, was this a broader plan of like, let's create a new fourth arm? I'm saying a fourth arm because we can think of the handheld devices being one, home consoles being another, and arcade also being a third arm, which at that point in time was very different in the case of Nintendo. But if you think of the broad hardware categories that existed at the time, those are the three big ones, right? There's arcade machines, home consoles, and handhelds. And so could this have been a fourth one? Had it been successful? Yes, I think so, right? They're not going to leave money on the table when there's money to be had. That's the sort of, in that sense, was obvious. But also by this time, the VR market was, when Virtual Boy comes out, when it's released, not when they started working on it, was already sort of kind of starting to crumble a little bit. There was a sense of like, okay, maybe the tech isn't quite there yet. The virtual reality arcades or the machines arcades weren't necessarily doing as well as they could have. More recently, and this is maybe 10 years ago or so, Miyamoto, in an interview, actually, they were commenting, I think this was with he was talking about the Virtual Boy for some reason, and he sort of mused and kind of thought about, he sort of was reflecting and thinking, yeah, if we had positioned the Virtual Boy as a toy, so a different kind of device entirely as a toy, and sold it that way, this device would have been considered a huge hit within Nintendo, which I thought was a really interesting way to think about it. So a one-off thing, it has 30 games or whatever, and then that would have been a huge success. At 700, almost 800,000 units sold, that sounds massive, right, for a toy?
Yeah, as a children's amusement, yeah. So I think Logan Brown Games has a question that's kind of similar to this that I'm gonna kind of finesse a little, where he says, did you find much about the industrial design of the Virtual Boy in your research? I've always been fascinated by the awkward middle ground between home and handheld console that it represents, and I'd love to know more about what Nintendo thought they were doing to try and navigate these poles. And I think an extension of this question is, what did Nintendo do to educate players, users, potential consumers on what this was as a category, right? In early personal computing, you see a lot of the same kind of effort where it's like, we have to teach you, a consumer, what this thing that you have never touched before and you have an unfamiliar form factor, what it even is, right? And where was Nintendo positioning it?
Yeah, so they were sort of unclear about where they positioned it. And to be clear, Benj and I, we only studied what was going on the US side of things. They ran a completely different marketing campaign in Japan that we did not study or look at all. And what's interesting is a couple of things. So I talked about their positioning it as a device for a 3D world that you could sort of step into and providing this sort of mind-altering experiences, and here, come and try it. What I didn't talk about is how the device itself, where it started from and how it changed internally within Nintendo. So originally the idea was that this would be closer to a VR helmet in the sense that you could sort of wear it. And so the initial technical specifications of the hardware were very, instead of using chips that were like power hungry, there's like, okay, what's the smallest chips we can use, the lightest things? We need battery life is really important. And then they started to worry about things such as, well, you're going to have this thing close to your face. Radiation might be an issue. So we need to put some steel on this thing so that to block some of that radiation. Oh, that's going to make it a lot heavier. That's a no-go then. What if there's a kid in the back of the car and they're playing on their Virtual Boy and there's an accident and they fly forward and smash their head into it? That's also a no-go. And so they basically had started to whittle away a lot of what was in the original concept, and to end up with a device that stands alone on legs on a table that you sort of look into. I think the original concept was much more independent, so you didn't have to plug it into the wall. Actually, you don't have to plug it into the wall. The battery pack is part of the controller. So the idea was it was going to be much more of a standalone device without the legs, without the tripod. There's a famous picture from one of the patents which shows a person with a Virtual Boy and a kind of a strap, and it's holding in place, and it's sort of held with a chest piece up front. Our sense is that went away out of liability fears and fears of sort of getting sued for accidents or just getting a bad reputation in front.
Wow,
The metal plating did not make it into the final version, but it might have been there at some point in time.
Yeah. If only Apple VR had you know, had this disappeared for the same concerns. I'm going to ask one final question from the chat. This is from Future Pepper. Jose, I really appreciated the historical connections between the Virtual Boy to paper peep shows, perspective boxes. I was wondering if there's a connection between the Virtual Boy and the 19th century stereoscope. I think a lot of us in the chat kind of saw that connection maybe first off. I feel like that's the kind of the most infamous of the 19th century amusement devices. And it's working on the same stereoscopic principles, right, as something like a Holmes stereoscope, right?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to think of it as a stereoscope. What the stereoscope usually didn't have in the context of early 19th century, what it was as an entertainment device, it was very much a parlor kind of device where I would hold it, like there's these holders, and I'd hold it up and see this cool picture, and pass it to my friend next to me. So the Virtual Boy is much more, I'd say, it's a more isolating experience. You really are sort of peering into this device where you can't see what I'm looking at because you can't have your friend kind of over your shoulder going like, oh, that's a cool picture. Like it doesn't work that way. Obviously, stereoscopic technology, the stereograph, early 18th century, predates photography actually, and we discuss it in the book. That definitely ties into this idea of like this concept of optical illusions and things that will like mess with their eyes. We also look at the stereograms. I don't remember if you guys remember, the 90s was also a big moment where there's these stereograms were really popular in some of those books, the Magic Eye.
Were you like soft cross your eyes and try to? Oh God, those things were a nightmare. Yeah.
They're a nightmare and bestsellers in the 90s.
Yeah. So very popular in the college dorm room of the 1990s.
Yeah.
I pulled down the stereoscope that I keep up on my shelf while you were talking, which just kind of, it brought back to me when I teach this in my history of media class. We teach a lot, like what's interesting is the different cultural role. The stereoscope was really about this idea of bringing reality to you. And so it was like about being able to see pictures from all across the world, right? Being able to, it was advertised as a way to put the whole globe within your grasp. Or to go around the world in just a matter of minutes. And it had all of these obviously kind of like colonial implications to that kind of visual practice too. Whereas all of that stuff kind of gets liquidated by the time you get to, 100 years later for the function of something like a Virtual Boy.
Yeah.
I think that will be our last question. If you have more questions, well, what are you going to do? You're going to have to buy the book. We have a discount code. It's ReadMIT20. If you go look up Seeing Red at Penguin Random House, is that right? I'll just do that. Yep, at Penguin Random House, you will get 20% off Seeing Red. And also, I'm going to put in a little plug that translation is a topic that's come up a couple times, and I'm just going to remind folks who, whether you're a longtime listener or you may not previously be aware, we do publish translations in ROMchip. We are always looking for folks interested in that, and there's a ton of work to be done in this space, particularly in that kind of Japanese to English, English to Japanese, transnational kind of knowledge share. So if that's something that you're interested in as a scholar, a lay enthusiast, whatever, shoot me an email. I would probably love to chat with you. With that, anything else, Jose? Anything else you want to share?
I just want to say thank you to everybody who watched this and who's watching this at a later date. I appreciate everyone's support. I'm super honored to have been invited. And our book is not the last word. And this is, I think, an exciting call to people to, let's do some more work. There's still a lot of unanswered questions. I think that's just an opportunity. We're hopefully opening the door to more people looking into the Virtual Boy and examining it deeply like we did. So thank you very much.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, everybody. Do be sure to sign up to join our newsletter, our Discord. Feel free to check out our journal, to donate, all that good stuff. I'll hang out in the chat for a little bit to answer any questions you might have about ROMchip. And otherwise, good night and good game.